I want to add my personal word of thanks to everyone, really the whole congregation, who's worked hard over the last year to see that the portico and the columns and the steeple and the balcony ceiling and the doors, the windows on the side have been repaired following the storms and the damage that preceded them. Surely, as the choir sings it, the psalmist is right. The dwelling places of the Lord are lovely. And part of what makes this dwelling place lovely is because of the lives that are woven into the tapestry of faith here over time. But it's work to maintain the house of the living God, and I'm grateful for the work, the folks from the contractor to the engineers, to the workers themselves, to those who gave so generously, to all of the different efforts that have been a part of restoring the front part of the church. It's wonderful that the sanctuary will be here now and that we are able to continue to worship in it and to lift up a witness to Jesus Christ into the years ahead. There's more to do in the life of the church, but we're right today to thank God that this part has been established. I'm grateful. I'm also grateful to gather with you in prayer. I know that different ones of you come with prayers on your hearts, and I share with you in those prayers. Some of you are here praying for someone you love who's sick. Some of you are praying for someone who's grieving. Some of you who are praying, I know, for some serving in other places. Whenever the church gathers for worship, we gather in prayer, and I'm praying with you. I know some of your prayers, and part of why we gather is to pray together. It's a support and it's a witness, and it's shared not only here, but by the church around the world. So we certainly pray for each other, but we also pray for other faith communities around us and around the world. Think about all of the lovely dwelling places, the sanctuaries that you have known, the different churches that you have visited or been a part of or worshiped in across the decades, and how good it is that we can pray for them as they gather in such a wide variety of different contexts today. And what a joy to be able to give children Bibles once again. I meant it when I told them it's more important than the sermon. That's why we put it before the sermon, so that I would feel the time pressure and not them. Yeah, I hope if you see them carrying their Bibles, you'll congratulate them. You'll affirm for them how important that is and how grateful we are that they have received the Bible. And let us read it too as an example, and that we might receive the benefits from that. Speaking of the Bible and the dwelling places of God and stories, we have another story today, a parable from the 18th chapter of Luke's Gospel, the second part of the chapter in the sequence in which we've been reading. Jesus tells another parable, probably the last parable we'll get now before we end this liturgical year. Beginning with verse 9, Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, was praying thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other people, thieves, rogues, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give a tenth of all my income. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but all who humble themselves will be exalted. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Jesus loves a good story. So does Luke. And Luke does a wonderful job of remembering so many of Jesus' stories. By my count, Luke remembers at least 25 of the stories, parables, that Jesus told, as well as the other narrative of his life. Luke remembers more stories in terms of parables than any other gospel writer does. And here we are encountering two parables, last week and this, and they're both about prayer. Do you remember last week's parable was about the unjust judge and the persistent widow? She knocking at his door, pleading all the time, and finally he grants her prayer request. That parable began with the exhortation to us, pray always so that you won't lose heart. And if you can't do always, I told you last week, then just pray a bit more. We'll take what we can get. So we had that about when to pray, and now we have this parable about how to pray immediately following it. And there are two examples in this story, two men, and in kind of classic style. One's the bad example, and one's the good example. But counter to your expectations, in their vocations, they switch roles here. They both in Jerusalem go up to the temple to pray. Where do you go to pray? Where's the holy place in your life that you go to pray? Certainly in this lovely dwelling place, but where else do you go to pray by yourself? There's some sacred spot where you go and kneel in the presence of the living God. The temple's a natural spot. I've been to the temple in Jerusalem and I've prayed there. Well, I've prayed at what remains of the temple, the wall, the western wall. Every day, people still go. There's someone praying there now. Where's the holy place that you go to pray? One who goes is a Pharisee. Pharisees are teachers and students of the law. We tend to vilify them, I think, because of the way they often show up in these stories. But remember, there's nothing wrong with being a student and teacher of the law, and we're talking about the religious law, the Old Testament scriptures. They believed in reading them. They believed in mastering them and then seeking to live them. Pharisees, one would expect, would know how to pray. They were a religious movement that emphasized the importance of obedience to the law of Moses. They emphasized living in accordance with Torah as a way of making God's benefits available and accessible in all aspects of life for those who are faithful. And so that's why it's different to hear the Pharisee lifted up as the example of what not to do. The Pharisee's prayer is a hymn of self-praise here, and it's based on derision of others. And did you see in the text it says, he stood by himself. He stands by himself. The other who goes is a tax collector, a despised figure because he works for the occupying empire. He takes money from his fellow citizens and keeps a cut for himself. That tax gathering system was notoriously corrupt. Now, tax collectors run for office and we elect them. It's a position of honor. But then they despise the tax collectors who indeed were oppressing the people and often cheating them. The tax collector's prayer, rather than the aggrandizement, is a personal confession of how far he falls short of God's intentions. And it's a request, a plea really, a plea for God's mercy. It's an example, I think, of how we also are called to confession. It's part of the longer reason why we have a prayer of confession at the beginning of every worship service. We come acknowledging that we're in need of God's mercy as well. But don't be confused here. The point of the parable is not that a serious intent to do the right thing, like the Pharisee is lifting up here, is bad. Nor is the point of the parable that a serious effort to exploit and oppress others is good. It isn't. The point is that arrogance before God, arrogance based on one's assumed superiority over others, that separates us from God. So Jesus says, the Pharisee stood by himself. He not only avoids others, he doesn't much need God. The tax collector is aware that he stands in need of God's mercy. He knows he is far from God's intention. And here in this story, he comes seeking that mercy. God's grace is on display here as absurdly generous. That's what we saw in the earlier parable about the prodigal son who returns home to find a welcome that isn't deserved. Do you think that humility is a virtue? Do you think that personally? The long witness of the Christian faith is that humility is not only a virtue, but that it's particularly a Christian virtue. As a culture, it doesn't seem to me that we prize humility as a virtue much anymore. It doesn't look to me like we lift up a hope for it or an encouragement for it out of others. But here in this parable, it's the chief virtue. The truth is, we stand completely in need of God's grace, all of us. And that's the great celebration of Reformation Sunday. We all stand in need of God's grace. We're all sinners saved only by Jesus Christ. So notice that when we sing Amazing Grace in church, and I see how much some of you love it when we sing it, especially when we sing it as the act of praise in response to confession, and I see the emotion it brings to you. Notice that when we sing Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, we sing Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. We don't sing Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like you. We cannot live a righteous life on our own. We're dependent on God's grace and God's forgiveness and substance in Jesus Christ. And we are dependent on Jesus' example, his teachings, his life, his death, his resurrection, which points us to the power of God's love that alone sustains us. Remember last week I told you I liked that parable because right up front, Luke tells us why Jesus was telling it, to encourage you to pray always and not to lose heart. And here now, Luke also has Jesus telling you again why he's telling this parable. Jesus told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. Here's the point. Avoid self-righteousness. Avoid contempt of others. The arrogance and the contempt are the point. Contempt is not simply not enjoying someone, nor is contempt actively disagreeing with someone, nor is contempt finding someone annoying. Contempt is the feeling that a person or thing is beneath consideration, without worth, deserving scorn. See how the parables consistently show God's care for those we can't imagine care for: the tax collector, the prodigal, the wandering sheep, the fruitless tree, the beggar at the gate. To be contemptuous with someone means to show a strong sense of disrespect and superiority towards them, viewing them as unworthy. One commentator points out, the greatest difference between the two praying men lies here. One has written off the other, while the other can speak only of his own brokenness. On Monday at the Followers of the Way, we come at the end of that Bible study, which meets at noon, and anybody is invited. We come at the end of that Bible study, and we try to think of a bumper sticker that summarizes the message out of the text. If you had to put the point of this text on a bumper sticker that you were willing to drive around with it on your car, what would it be? And on Monday, I said, I think the bumper sticker should say, God be merciful to me, a sinner. What would that be like if that was the bumper sticker that you put on your car? If you drove around towns with that bumper sticker saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. It's right out of this text. I got more enthusiastic about it as the week went on. I said to Emily, what would it be like about Thursday night if everybody in the congregation put a bumper sticker on their car that said, God be merciful to me, a sinner? What would the community think if we all showed up with that message on our bumper stickers? God be merciful to me, a sinner. She said, well, your membership would go down. You have to be careful of irony here. In our humility, we don't want to end up being arrogant. The tax collector prays apart from others too. Humility is a Christian virtue. It's not meant to be a source of pride. There was a story about an Oxford professor whose character, whose teaching, whose service to others was so exemplary, so moving, so unassuming, that on a Friday afternoon at the faculty assembly, the faculty presented him their award for humility, and they hung it on a ribbon around his neck. They had to take it away from him on Monday, though, because he wore it to class. Never assume we know who is outside of God's mercy. Never assume we know who has earned God's affirmation. We are all dependent on God's grace. That's what Reformation Sunday best remembers, that we are saved by God's grace alone, and that grace is best made known to us in Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God for the generosity of God's great love. Amen.